You're listening to an IOE podcast from the UCL Institute of Education. Powered by UCL Minds.
This is Research for the Real World. Conversations with researchers and the paths they've taken to help shape our everyday lives. Hello, I'm Rob Webster. I'm an Associate Professor here at the IOE. On this episode, we are in conversation with Professor Gemma Moss. Gemma is a Professor of Literacy and the Director of the International Literacy Centre at the IOE. Gemma is an experienced and distinguished researcher. She is a Fellow of the Academy of Social Sciences, and between 2015 and 17, Gemma was the President of the British Educational Research Association. Gemma's main research interests are in literacy and gender, literacy policy, and how knowledge flows in education between policy, research, and practice. Together with colleagues at the IOE, Gemma is currently running a project called A Duty of Care and a Duty to Teach: Educational Priorities During the COVID-19 Crisis. It's a study tracking teachers' responses to the pandemic and how it has affected them. Today, we're going to find out what Gemma and the team have been learning from the study, and we'll also gaze into the Research for the Real World crystal ball to see what all this means for the future of education in the UK. Gemma, hello and welcome to the podcast.
Thank you very much, Rob. Pleased to be here.
Gemma, let's start with you and your professional journey, shall we? So you started at the IOE in 1989 and you've held a variety of interesting positions here. So tell us about some of those roles and also what brought you into research in the first place.
Well, I think what brought me into research in the first place was questions I couldn't answer standing in my own classroom. That is now a very long time ago, but I initially came on a master's course and I just got hooked on the whole process of research. One of the main points in my career, or main highlights in my career, has been a study of gender and literacy, looking at patterns of underachievement in classrooms and how they arise and how teachers try to deal with them. Most of my work has been done from what I would broadly describe as an ethnographic perspective. So that is very much looking at participants' interactions in their social worlds, why they look the way they do, what motivates participants, and how the social context shapes their interactions.
What do you think having been a teacher brings to the job of doing research?
I think what it brings to me, and is particularly relevant for the project we're currently engaged with, is trying to understand the complexity of a teacher's role from their perspective. That partly means being aware of how much teachers are always making minute-to-minute decisions. So there isn't really a script. You can devise scripted pedagogies, people try and do so, but actually teaching is primarily about human interaction, and human interaction that is taking place in a social space. And it's that dynamic between what the space tells you you can do, you should do, you might be able to do, and what actually happens that intrigues me.
So teachers are very much our focus of this podcast, and in particular, the Duty of Care, Duty to Teach project. So this is work that's been documenting primary school teachers' experiences over the period of lockdown, and it includes their reflections on how education might need to change in view of what they've been through with COVID. And we're going to explore all of that in this conversation. But I wanted to ask you to just unpack those two terms in the project title for us, first of all: duty of care and duty to teach. Can you tell us what those terms refer to? And then perhaps also why you feel it's been important to capture the views and experiences of teachers over the spring and summer?
I can indeed, because the project title came directly from me watching on TV at the start of the lockdown period, a short film showing a deputy head teacher tramping 8 or so miles around his own catchment area for his primary school, delivering packed lunches to kids who would otherwise go hungry. And for me, a duty of care is the duty of care that teachers have for their pupils, partly on a purely human level. So there was no particular funding to do this with. There was no direction from government that schools should be making sure that children were fed. This was a teacher fully aware of the needs within their own local community and reacting to them on a purely human level. Now, what immediately struck me was that this is part and parcel of what primary schools in particular think that they're there for. You'd be hard put to find a primary school teacher who doesn't think they have a duty of care to the pupils in their classroom. They understand and know their communities very well because they're geographically close to them. And that's an important part of what they do. The education system, as we currently have it constituted in this country, neglects that function. It doesn't give schools any brownie points for organising a food bank. It doesn't see that as part of the primary way in which they will be judged. Instead, all of the focus in the public discussion about teaching falls on their role in enabling children to pass tests, to leave school on a trajectory that will take them gainfully into employment some years down the road. What we wanted to know was, what does COVID and that very clear need to respond to a care agenda for pupils do in terms of perhaps making more visible publicly that very different role which is often ignored? And also, how does it enable teachers to think about their work, experiencing those tension points between having a duty to care for pupils and having a duty to teach them?
So are those concepts, I mean, they're related, but is there any sense in which they might be competing with one another? Not intentionally, perhaps, but it's perhaps indicative of the various balls that teachers have to juggle.
Well, I think part of the problem is that we do have an accountability system in England, and I am talking about England quite specifically here, which cannot account for the duty of care that schools hold for children in their classrooms when that community that they serve is experiencing poverty, is experiencing high levels of economic inactivity, everything that comes with that within our current society. So when Ofsted inspects, it, yes, asks for free school meals data, but we know that free school meals depends upon whether parents take up an offer of a free school meal. It doesn't really pay attention to the levels of deprivation and material poverty that exist within a community. It doesn't recognise it. And as I say, schools on that basis do not get any rewards, particularly for reacting and dealing with children under the most difficult circumstances. Now, COVID makes that visible because we've all seen, in a way, how important a role schools play. If children are in lockdown, children in very deprived communities, they no longer have access to the support of teachers. That particularly matters if they're living in perhaps dysfunctional families. There may be high levels of violence, alcoholism, we don't know what. If you take the school out of the picture, there's a gap for the support for that child. And COVID has drawn attention to that and put it very much back on the public agenda, partly through the work of the Children's Commissioner, who has been consistently through the project drawing attention to that role that schools play. And for me, it's an opportunity. The crisis is an opportunity to try and put some of this right, to try and think again about the broader role that schools play in their community, rather than just obsessing about the actual scores that children achieve in test instruments.
That's definitely a theme that we will come back to, about the broader implications of all of this and what it might all mean. But we'll come to the results of the project so far in a moment. But first of all, can you just tell us how you gathered the data and who was involved and how many teachers and so on?
Well, right from the go-get, we knew that we would have difficulties collecting data because under COVID, you can't do a lot of things that you would normally do. We made a strategic decision to build into our bid co-partnering with an organisation called TeacherTap. That's run by Becky Allen, who used to work at the IOE and is now at Brighton University. And it's a telephone survey where teachers register for the survey, and then every week they'll get sent 3 questions. The advantage for us to using TeacherTap to collect the data is that when teachers register, they link to the unique school reference number. So we get very accurate information about the nature of the community that they are working with. And with TeacherTap, we put out a questionnaire of 10 questions, which is more questions than teachers normally get. And 2,000 plus teachers opened the 10 questions, 1,600 answered. And in the analysis, one of the advantages again of using TeacherTap is that they were able to weight the sample responses so that we've got a representative sample from schools across the country and in terms of different types of schools. And it's given us a very rich and very reliable database. We subsequently followed up with a follow-on survey run via ILC. It attracted less response, partly because we were running it very close to the end of term, but we used it in a different way to get qualitative answers. So we had far more open-ended questions, and we followed up with teacher interviews conducted remotely. So the other side to the project, and I think what's partly given it its strength, is that throughout the period we have been tracking documents on education and COVID in the public domain, mainly government guidance, the professional press, but also the response of the research community, professional associations, professional organisations. And one of the most intriguing aspects of the project was that very early on, that revealed that the way COVID in education has been discussed in the media is quite different from teachers' own priorities.
Let's dig into that a little bit more about teachers' priorities then. So this is the results around their duty to teach and duty to care. So can you tell us a bit more about that? What have teachers been saying?
Well, what we did, and again, this is very different from other people who tried surveying teachers. So NFER have had more funding than we have. We've got funding from the ESRC, they have funding from the Nuffield Trust. They've largely asked teachers, how many pieces of work have you been setting? How many pieces of work have pupils been sending back? We didn't ask teachers that. We asked them, what are your priorities? What are you spending time doing? How much of your time is going on things like delivering food parcels, checking on vulnerable children, making sure that you've made contact with families? So we did this a different way round. So rather than saying, is what you're doing different from what you would normally do in school, we just said to them, what kinds of things are you doing? Keeping in mind, we were thinking care means thinking about pupil well-being, thinking about pupil welfare, thinking about pupil health, and teach means also encouraging children to learn at home, creating opportunities for them to learn at home. So on those two kind of different dimensions, we asked teachers, what are they doing? And it was from listening to what it was that they were actually doing that we built up our own sense of their own priorities.
And just give us a flavour of what those priorities are for teachers.
Well, one of the things that came across very clearly very early on was that thinking ahead to catch up was not a priority for teachers. That's been so right the way through our period of data collection. Now, that seems quite counterintuitive, as a lot of the media discourse has been about gaps, widening gaps between the most disadvantaged, the least disadvantaged, learning loss, all of which partly took us off to look at the literature on learning loss. And that's been an interesting story. I'll get back to that in a minute. But the teachers themselves were much more concerned about pupil well-being, ensuring that they were safe, and then enabling them to have interesting and engaging things to do. So, in setting learning tasks at home, teachers instinctively understood that you couldn't replicate what was going on at school. You had to send home things that would be engaging, where parents could help children if they were sufficiently young, and you had to think about the tasks differently. So again, some of the media discourse very early on was comparing what the state sector was doing with what private schools are doing. And private schools were managing to organize lessons online, and you had the feeling that a child would be dressing up in their uniform at home in the morning and then sitting in front of the laptop, yeah, and kind of talking with the teacher in their class, and it would completely mimic what was going on in the classroom. Well, private schools can do that if A, they have the technology, B, they know their pupils have the technology, C, they know their pupils have the technology and a space at home where they will be on their own interrupted and therefore can pretend they are at school. A large number of our teachers were telling us that their kids did not have access to technology. Maybe there is one phone in a household. The pupil won't get it uninterrupted. And if you're living in a small flat, maybe you've got 2 bedrooms, you can't find quiet space to go to. So actually, a lot of what teachers were doing was ensuring that under those circumstances, children actually got lesson packs. So they'd be making up lesson packs at the start of the week, taking them to the doorstep to enable those children to learn. So that sense of the priorities coming from the teachers themselves, it shows you how care and teach sort of interact and overlap, and they shouldn't be treated as in competition with each other, and one is not less important than the other.
That's really interesting. It shows what we miss, or what, perhaps more specifically, what policymakers miss when they don't ask the profession what they think the priorities are, and because they have a view on that, and that's very much informed by what they know about their communities.
I think it shows you that policymakers miss that. It also shows you that quite a lot of the research community misses that. So, one of the things we've been doing is tracking the research responses on the part of the research community, and often they have been as out of sync as the policymakers. All right. So, a lot of what researchers have been doing, I shouldn't talk down my own profession too much, but quite often the instinct has been to wheel out something you already know about and just sort of make it fit COVID. So, leadership is my area. I'm going to tell you some things about leadership that are bound to matter during COVID times. But you don't wait to ask. And it may be that the dilemmas are quite different. I mean, we do know, and this is from wider teacher tap data, that heads have been under enormous stress throughout this period. And that's partly because government is organised in such a way it's loaded a lot of responsibility onto heads to make very difficult judgment calls with insufficient information. It's also because a lot of the policy guidance has actually been completely wrong footed when it comes. So the early instruction from the DFE that when schools reopen, they must reopen on 2 meters distancing. I mean, any teacher could have told you that if you put all pupils in 2 meters apart, you need double the classroom space and double the teaching staff. So now that's gone back to policymakers. Just to stick with the researchers, though, I think one of the most difficult things for us as a team is that often the headlines in the newspapers have come from newspapers reacting to quantitative researchers making calculations on the back of data that they've seen about learning loss and gaps. And one of the clear differences there is that if you're asking about the amount of work that a parent thinks a teacher has done set, or the amount of pieces that a pupil has returned, the calculation is being made as if that pupil was in school, there would be more pieces of work set, more pieces of work returned. They don't pay any attention to the different orchestration of time in a classroom. If you are in a classroom, you don't spend all of your time working. Actually, students will spend some of their time finding their ruler, looking for their stuff, going to sit down. They'll spend some of their time chatting with their friends, not listening to the teacher. So you're making false comparisons between what you assume is an absence of directed time on task at home and an absolute presence of directed time on task in school from 9 till 3. They're false comparisons. And again, where we've seen that most clearly represented is on quantitative researchers who often don't know very much about the ins and outs of a primary school and how a primary school really works, and are then just looking at the maths, as it were. They're doing complicated sums without thinking about what does this really mean as lived experience on the ground.
You wrote something very interesting for Schools Week on this issue of learning loss, and you were saying we need to exercise some caution about the estimates that are being provided. Could you just take us through a couple of reasons why that is?
Well, you've reminded me that one of the other elements in the research design, which I haven't mentioned so far, is we are doing a rapid evidence assessment on topics that matter. So we have been complementing our research design. So in the US, people worry about the length of summer holidays. They have a very long break in some areas, maybe as long as 3 months. So that's why they've investigated learning loss. Is there such a thing? They judge whether learning loss happens during an extended gap from school by taking test results from the end of school year in summer and comparing them to test results in the start of the autumn term. If you do that, you can find what looks like learning loss. One of the factors which makes that less reliable than it should be is they often don't use the same test instruments. So the test instrument they use in the autumn term is against the skill set they're going to be teaching that next year, as opposed to the test in the summer term, which was for the year before. So you've already got a problem around the comparability between those two measures. The best work we've seen on this is by somebody who, ahead of the COVID crisis, had bothered to look at that data by mapping to what happens to kids subsequently. Okay, so rather than looking at 2 points, so summer term, autumn term, she's looking at what happens to kids over the full next year. And what she was able to demonstrate by looking at that fuller data set is that the children who lost most between the summer and the autumn test points often regained most subsequently in the year. So you can't decide that just because this person has lost, they're never going to get it back. They just probably need time to settle in and remember. And she was also able to show that there is some children will have gained despite the summer break in ways that can't be explained. So kids from disadvantaged areas may come back with more than what they seem to have at the end of the summer. In other words, learning is a varied process. It takes place across time, across contexts. And the conclusion that she drew for COVID, quite specifically, is the one thing you can be certain of as a teacher is that we will get more variation. There will be more mixed ability, as it were, within the class that you meet the other side of the disruptive period. So that's her best advice, is it's not to presume there's this amount of gap and we must all immediately identify where it is and then struggle to fill it. It's that actually needs are going to be hugely varied, and they will be varied for any group of children. That implies that rather than leaping to catch up as a first resort, actually what teachers need to do is give kids time to settle back into classroom. And as they're settling into classroom, give them time to consolidate, remember where it was they were before, and then gradually build up their resilience, their capacity to learn, so that you can get them back on track. So getting kids back on track is not a quick business. It's not a matter of making a fast judgment. It's not a matter of being scared by general figures. It's about paying attention to the here and now and what's going on in my classroom. These kids,
I want to ask you about the catch-up process in a second, but just as you were laying that out for us, I just wondered whether some of that is what you're describing is intuitive to primary school teachers, and maybe that's part of the reason why they didn't seem so preoccupied, shall we say, with catch-up at the start of lockdown. You know, they knew it would be important, but it wasn't something they were worried about. I'm just wondering whether that's a sort of almost a professional intuition that they knew that they'd be meeting, as you say, a wider range of attainment on the other side, whenever that was going to be.
I think that's very true. And again, it comes back to understanding how teachers know what they know. They know what they know, interaction with their families, their kids. We were very aware that the experience of COVID has been very different for different communities. So, teachers working with the most advantaged communities were far more likely to be having pressure applied to them by parents during lockdown who were worrying about themselves whether has enough work been set? Are you sending my kid home enough things to do? All right. So they were under that kind of pressure. Whereas those working in the most deprived communities were often worried about far more basic issues to do with health and basic welfare and keeping the family together. So teachers deal with the problems that are in front of them. They're trained to deal with the problems that are in front of them. They're trained to think about what is best for this child, this pupil. And we have to go with that. And I think it's, for me, one of the key lessons from this whole business is that policymakers and some researchers just simply do not listen enough to what teachers themselves would be perfectly capable of telling them if anybody asked. It's the capacity of this government in particular not to ask teachers is quite striking. And it's opened up, I think, a flaw in the current way in which we organise education in this country, that teachers are told what to do by people operating some miles away in Whitehall who actually have very little understanding of what the real job involves.
So let me ask you this then, Gemma. We know, let's just sort of, I suppose I'll put this on the table then. The very unprecedented, fast moving situation, schools were, the decision to close schools in March was taken, and everybody throughout the system, schools, teachers, families, local authorities, and government, of course, were all kind of faced with this uncertainty. Things, as we know, were bumpy. Some things went well, others went less so. So if I just invite you to play the role of Captain Hindsight just for one moment, in terms of where the priorities were put on home learning and so on, what do you think we should have done? Was it right, for example, to try and press on with teaching online, or in terms of what you were describing with the teachers in your survey, should there perhaps been a more of an emphasis on well-being at the start?
I think there should have been a more emphasis on well-being from the start. I also think that we are, in a way, suffering from some of the, well, austerity has meant that social services in many places are barely functioning, and the close connection that there was once built between social services and education has, in many respects, been allowed to fray, and that's been unfortunate. With the benefit of hindsight, part of the problem with the way in which policy has tried to react is I think it's been focused way too much on headlines and not realities. So schools knew very early on there were going to be problems for families with food, with literally feeding kids. They know how dependent some families are on schools providing meals for them. It took a footballer to make an absolute fuss on social media to get this government to fund food for families right the way through the summer. Now, that's quite extraordinary, actually. And so some of what we're seeing is a level of dysfunctionality in the system which needs more repair. Um, there are other things where I think there were good intentions around technology, but again, from a headline grabbing point of view, let's give a laptop to every child sounds great. In practice, the laptops have never materialized. And where there is an absence of technology and an absence of conditions under which the technology would be useful, i.e., a quiet space to use it, actually hard copy alternatives are probably as good as we can manage. Now, under those situations, maybe the alternative with the benefit of hindsight would be to say, this is a crisis. Schools are going to need more resourcing. Let's give them some COVID resourcing. All right, you could then have made that resourcing proportionate to need using indicators of disadvantage. Now, the Education Policy Institute put forward a proposal along those lines very early on in the crisis, and it's never really been picked up.
You've been drawing our attention to I guess, what are long-standing dysfunctions in the education system. And another one that, of course, sprang up over the summer was the farrago with A-levels and GCSEs. And that, among other things, revealed something of a shortcoming in the way our assessment and qualification systems seem very heavily reliant end of course exams. And if you don't have them, what do you do? So, as you've been indicating, there are deep questions about the fairness and the resilience of the education system. So, have the teachers in the survey highlighted similar things? I mean, what's on their mind in terms of where they think the education system should go from here?
Well, one of the issues that attracted teacher attention very early on was the way in which the accountability system actually penalises schools operating in disadvantaged areas. And I think there was a stronger reaction to that as we found in our survey data, partly because Ofsted very early on issued some very unhelpful statements, basically saying teachers aren't doing enough to keep learning going during this disrupted period. We're going to be checking on you. Now, at a moment when teachers have actually got lots of other things on their plate around that duty to care, to have Ofsted make those kinds of comments, something like 65% of the teachers in our most advantaged areas agreed with the statement that the current accountability system or needs to change. I can't remember exactly what we asked them, but it was something like the current accountability system needs to change or it will be unfair to those working in the most disadvantaged schools. 85% of those in the most disadvantaged schools also agreed. So we are seeing some discontent. This is true. I'm aware that there's a risk of me sounding like a doom monger around all of this and producing a very long list of what is currently wrong. Actually, I think the good side of the project is it's pointed to some really quite simple solutions. One, to take time and not get bounced into running fast catch up in the autumn term. Most schools are doing that. Some schools have said we're going to have a whole term just doing recovery, as in getting kids back into school, getting them engaged with learning, getting them re-socializing with each other, getting them feeling secure and relaxed as the foundation to learning later. That is, to my mind, that's quite right. To insist that, everybody must, all the year one kids from last summer must resit the phonics screening check in the second half of the autumn term, this is just giving the wrong messages. So again, a lot of this, it is about teachers on the ground have common sense. They know what the issues are. They can steer us well out of this crisis. And I think what I'd most like from politicians is an acknowledgement that teachers will steer communities out of this crisis. They need to be able to plan in sensible ways on how they will do that, taking into account the local circumstances in their schools. There isn't a blanket recovery plan that is going to work for everywhere. Each school needs to make its own assessment in the light of the way that COVID has impacted for them and then find a way through from that. I don't think this is a disaster which is going to scar people for life. I mean, that's one of the uses of vocabulary that does come out of economics. I think this is wrong. Children are by nature resilient. School teachers are very committed to their pupils. They will find a way through this. They need the time to be able to do it on their own terms, under their own steam, as it were, and not get a lot of kind of apparent micromanaging as to what it is they should do from other people who aren't directly familiar with their local situation.
I think there's something in what you're saying, Gemma, and I don't know what I just have a sense that the resilience of our schools and the resilience of our teachers and the resilience of our children and young people within our schools may surprise us, but only on the basis I almost think we've been primed to expect some, like as you've been saying, the learning loss to be really quite great. And I'd like to think that we'll bounce back from this quicker and better than perhaps what we've been primed to believe. So I suppose in that sense, I kind of am optimistic. What I'm curious to know your view on is, who do you think might get the credit for this? Do you think a government would be very keen to take the credit for the bounce back, or will the profession get their fair share of the credit if that's what happens?
That is such a good question, Rob. I mean, I think one then comes down to bounce back on whose terms. And that's why I want to keep on putting care in the picture, because bounce back in a community ravaged by insecure employment, all of the economic damage that's going to happen from COVID may mean just simply kids being in school on a regular basis, enjoying what they're doing and wanting to turn up. That in itself would be bounce back. If we judge bounce back on the very narrow measures that we currently have, the norm for success in the phonics screening check is this. Have we hit exactly the same measure? Oh, if we haven't, let everybody panic. This is completely inappropriate. We recovery is going to be long term. I remember listening to Leonora Cruddas, I think, who is the CEO for an organization that supports MATs, as in testimony that she gave to the Education Select Committee into the COVID inquiry, saying from the point of view of the experience of large academy chains, sorry, that's what a MAT is, a large academy chain, the prospect of reopening schools and having kids back in is no different from the prospect of taking over a school that's been underperforming, and you expect to turn it around, but you expect to turn it around in 1 to 2 years. So, it's policymakers need to not be impatient. They need to fully register that schools have an important role to play in their community, in stabilising and supporting their communities through difficult times. And on that basis, we could all end up with a bounce back from which we all claim, rather than competing for it. I think that's what I would hope for. There is a lot going on within the school system itself that precisely makes me hopeful, because teachers aren't listening to the silly stuff. They're not getting driven into a panic by all of this, because they see much more clearly a real need in front of them, which they know how to react to, really. Now, there is more technical stuff around COVID. What do you do when a member of staff is diagnosed as having COVID? That's much more difficult, and there everybody is up against it. There's a lot of things we don't know about the virus, but in terms of dealing with kids and families through difficult times, I think schools are very resilient organisations, and they're going to do that because that's their job.
I just have one final question for you, Gemma. We've been talking about the impact of COVID, but in the context of how this might be an opportunity to change some long-standing things about the system, which we know weren't working particularly well. So I'm going to use the power invested in me by this podcast to make you Prime Minister for the day, and invite you to make one irreversible change to the system. So tell us what you would do.
Well, one is a bit, that's a bit of a hard ration. Uh,
Oh, you're only Prime Minister for a day, so you're going to have to work quickly.
I think what I would do is institute immediately a thoroughgoing reform of the test and accountability system that we run with in England. It isn't fit for purpose. It's grown up topsy-turvy. It's based on a just-in-time delivery metaphor, which presumes that if you don't deliver the goods to students right now, at the time that I tell you you're going to get tested about X, they'll never learn it. It needs fundamental rethinking. And as part of that rethinking, we need to be able to put in place measures that actually reflect the context, the home context, the community context, the wider economic context that influences how children can learn in school. We need to do better on this and then use that to steer more funding to the places where funding needs to go.
Gemma, thank you so much. It's been marvellous to talk with you today. Thank you for joining us on the podcast.
Not at all. I've enjoyed the chance to talk about it. It's not often you get a chance to say what you really think.
Thank you. We will put a link to the project webpage in the episode notes, so you'll be able to access the resources that Gemma mentioned, and also do have a look at the very readable and thought-provoking blogs and articles that Gemma and her team have been writing. It's well worth a look. We're now into our 5th season of Research for the Real World. It's a good time then for us to consult with you, dear listener, on what you'd like about the podcast and sound you out on future topics that you would like us to delve into. There's a link to a short feedback survey in the episode notes. It'll take you only 2 or 3 minutes to complete. We'd love to hear your views if you can spare the time to complete it. Remember, our back catalogue and our Spotify playlist of songs chosen by our guests and the IOE podcast team are available for your listening pleasure via our UCL webpage. Just search Research for the Real World. I'm Rob Webster. Goodbye.
Thanks so much for downloading and listening to this IOE podcast from the UCL Institute of Education, University College London.